Good morning and welcome to this week's Reset for Life moment. For the next few months, I'm going to use these videos really to highlight some questions that you may have about God. They're all going to start off with the question, what do we do when God? You know, no matter if you're new to Christianity or if you're just checking it out, or maybe if you've been serving God for a while, these are natural questions that I think we may all have, but may not want to admit. Questions like this: what do we do when God disappoints us? What do we do when God is too slow for us? What do we do when God is silent? That's a good one. And what do we do when God seems unfair? For today, I want to ask the question, what do we do when God doesn't seem to make sense? 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 17 to 25 really tells a story, a couple of stories actually, about David, who had just become the king of Israel. When the Philistines, who were really the arch enemies of Israel, heard that David was now king, the whole army marched to the southwest corner of Jerusalem and they spread themselves out all over the valley of Rephaim. They really were itching for a fight and they had plans to capture David. Wisely, David ran to a stronghold in the mountains so that he could consult with God. The reality was, David was not afraid of a good fight. He was the same guy who as a young lad had clubbed a lion and a bear to death when they tried to steal his sheep. And he was the same guy who a few years later faced a 9-foot giant named Goliath and beat him up and killed him. David wasn't afraid to mix it up with the enemy, but he knew that as king he needed to have God's direction. And so rather than running to the fight, he actually ran to God. Friends, I would suggest that we need to do the same. Rather than trying to fix stuff on our own, we should, like David, really consult God first and ask for His direction and for His plan. And so in verse 19 of that chapter, David says to God, should I go out and fight against the Philistines? Will you hand them over to me? And God replies, yes, go ahead. I will certainly hand them over to you. So in verse 20, David goes out against the enemy and he defeats them, and he immediately exclaims, the Lord did this. You see, he knew it wasn't his skill or his timing or his ability that really won the battle. It was God's. And you and I can learn a lot from that. If we have asked God to provide a miracle for us or an answer for a particular situation in our lives, and He does, then make sure that He receives the glory for that or the honor for that. Don't try to steal away that glory and honor from God by taking it for yourself. It's a surefire way not to hear God's voice in leading in your life again. Now, if you haven't stopped listening by now, here's where it starts to get really interesting. The Philistines came back. They were not done with David yet. They again spread themselves in the valley of Rephaim. And David wisely didn't assume that he knew what God wanted to do. And so he goes back to God in prayer and again says to him, what do you want me to do? David could have adopted a been there, done that kind of a mentality or an attitude. He could have assumed that he knew what God wanted, but he didn't. Instead, he asked God for direction again. And I want to challenge you on that one. We can never assume that we know what God wants. You see, in another book of the Bible, God spoke through the prophet named Isaiah. And he says in chapter 55, my ways are higher than your ways and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. You know, as mere mortals, we are limited by time and space and knowledge, but God is not. And learning to follow Him is learning to trust Him when He doesn't make sense, at least not to our own human understanding. So God says to David, don't attack them straight on like you did last time. Instead, circle around back and attack near the poplar trees. In fact, God says, I want you to wait until you hear the sound of the rushing of the wind through the poplar trees and then attack. So David did exactly what God said and routed the Philistines again. I want you to notice that David didn't argue with God. David didn't say, you know what, God, are you sure? Because last time I went straight out at them and it worked pretty well, so why can't we do that again? He was okay with God mixing it up. And he was okay with God not making sense, at least not to his previous experience. Instead, he trusted God. And I think here's the lesson for us. When God doesn't seem to make sense, when God is asking us to do something completely different than the last time we faced that same situation, when the rules seem to keep changing, go back to God in prayer and never assume you know what God wants. And keep in mind that He's using that situation really to test our obedience. He wants to know if we're truly going to be surrendered to His will and to His plan, or if we're just going to take a portion of what we know and run with it as if we've got it all figured out. David was humble enough to ask again, and then he was committed enough to carry out this new direction without question. That's important for us to remember today. Friends, sometimes God calls us to do things that according to human logic just don't seem to make sense. Maybe He's been speaking to you about giving up a habit or breaking off a relationship with a person who is toxic. Maybe God has allowed you to go through some suffering and some pain, and it doesn't make sense because you think He's supposed to be a loving God, and you can't really equate the two of those things. Maybe you are lonely and struggling with anxiety or depression, and you don't understand why God would allow that. Maybe God's, quote, wonderful plan for your life, His plan to give you a future and a hope, as Jeremiah 29:11 promises, maybe all of that doesn't seem to include the things that you thought it should, and it doesn't seem to make sense. You know, there are so many maybes and so many what-ifs in life, but the life of David teaches us to trust God implicitly, and especially when He doesn't seem to make sense to us. We may never know the reasons why God does what He does until we reach heaven. Until then, we have to be okay with Him not making sense all of the time, at least to us. The answer or the antidote to that uncertainty in our lives is really to trust and to obey, to carry out what He's asked us to do, and to trust Him to figure out the results. That's really my Reset for Life word for you for today. Before I go, though, don't forget to check out our social media accounts this week. You will find on them some new COVID protocols for Sunday. God bless.